The making of a hero. Sarah Martinez never imagined that her quiet childhood in rural Texas would prepare her for one of the most intense battlefields of the 21st century. Born to a family of farmers, she learned early that life often demanded more than you thought you could give. Her father, Miguel, worked 16-hour days in the scorching sun, while her mother, Elena, juggled 3 jobs to keep their small family afloat. Sarah was the youngest of 4 children, and money was always tight. When Sarah was 12, her grandmother suffered a massive heart attack during Sunday dinner. While the adults panicked and called for help, Sarah instinctively began performing CPR that she had learned from a Red Cross poster at school. For 20 minutes, she kept her grandmother's heart beating until paramedics arrived. That moment changed everything for her. She realized she had a gift for staying calm when others fell apart. High school brought new challenges. Sarah's grades were excellent, but college seemed like an impossible dream. Her parents simply couldn't afford tuition, and scholarships were competitive. During her senior year, a military recruiter visited their school. He spoke about opportunities for education, training, and service to country. Sarah listened intently as he described the role of a combat medic. The idea of saving lives while serving her nation appealed to her deeply. Against her parents' wishes, Sarah enlisted in the Army immediately after graduation. Her mother cried for days, terrified that her baby girl would be sent to war zones. Her father remained silent, but Sarah could see the pride mixed with fear in his eyes. Basic training at Fort Sam Houston was brutal. The physical demands pushed her small frame to its limits, but Sarah's determination never wavered. Combat medic training was even more intense. Sarah learned to treat gunshot wounds, perform emergency surgery under pressure, and evacuate casualties under enemy fire. Her instructors were impressed by her natural ability to remain focused during chaotic scenarios. While other trainees struggled with the stress, Sarah seemed to thrive. She graduated at the top of her class and received orders that would change her life forever. The deployment notice came on a Tuesday morning. Sarah was being sent to Afghanistan as part of a forward operating base medical team. The base was located in one of the most dangerous provinces, where Taliban attacks were frequent and casualties were high. Her unit would be responsible for providing medical support to infantry patrols that ventured into hostile territory daily. When Sarah arrived at Forward Operating Base Courage, the reality of war hit her immediately. The base was surrounded by high walls topped with razor wire. Guard towers loomed at every corner, manned by soldiers scanning the horizon for threats. The sound of helicopters was constant, bringing in supplies and evacuating wounded soldiers. The medical facility was a converted shipping container that had been expanded with additional modules to accommodate the steady stream of casualties. Dr. James Peterson, the base surgeon, welcomed Sarah with a mixture of relief and concern. He had been short-staffed for months, and the workload was overwhelming. Sarah was one of only 3 medics assigned to support nearly 800 soldiers. Dr. Peterson explained that her duties would extend far beyond traditional medic responsibilities. She would need to accompany patrols into dangerous areas, establish aid stations in forward positions, and sometimes make life-or-death decisions without supervision. Sarah's first week was relatively quiet, giving her time to familiarize herself with the base layout and procedures. She organized medical supplies, conducted equipment checks, and got to know the soldiers she would be treating. Many were young men barely out of high school, scared but trying to appear brave. Others were seasoned veterans on their 3rd or 4th deployment, carrying invisible wounds from previous tours. The calm was shattered on a Monday morning when mortars began falling inside the base perimeter. Sarah was in the medical facility when the first explosion shook the building. Alarms blared as soldiers ran for cover. Within minutes, the radio crackled with reports of casualties from a patrol that had been caught in an ambush just outside the wire. Sarah grabbed her medical bag and ran toward the landing zone where helicopters would bring in the wounded. The first chopper appeared on the horizon, flying low and fast. As it touched down, Sarah could see blood on the windows. The crew chief jumped out and began pulling stretchers from the aircraft. Sarah's training took over as she assessed each casualty, determining who needed immediate attention and who could wait. The first soldier had taken shrapnel to his chest. Sarah quickly established an airway and started an IV while directing others to prepare the operating room. The second casualty had lost his left leg below the knee. Sarah applied a tourniquet and called for blood products. Throughout the chaos, she moved with purpose and precision, never showing the fear that churned in her stomach. For 6 hours, Sarah worked alongside Dr. Peterson to save lives. They performed emergency surgery on 5 soldiers, stabilized 3 others for evacuation to larger hospitals, and treated numerous minor wounds. When the last patient was finally stable, Sarah stepped outside for the first time since the morning attack. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Sarah sat on a concrete barrier and finally allowed herself to process what had happened. She had helped save lives under the most intense circumstances she had ever experienced. Despite the exhaustion and stress, she felt a sense of purpose that she had never known before. Dr. Peterson found her there 20 minutes later. He sat down beside her without speaking for several moments. Finally, he turned to her and said something that would stay with Sarah for the rest of her life. He told her that in all his years of military medicine, he had rarely seen such natural ability and composure in a young medic. He believed she had the potential to become one of the finest combat medics the Army had ever produced. That night, Sarah called her parents from the communication center. She couldn't tell them details about the day's events due to security restrictions, but she assured them she was safe and doing important work. Her mother's voice was filled with worry, while her father asked if she needed anything. Sarah realized that she had everything she needed right there at that remote base in Afghanistan. She had found her calling. Trial by fire. 3 months into her deployment, Sarah had already earned a reputation among the soldiers at Forward Operating Base Courage. They called her Angel because of her ability to appear wherever casualties occurred, seemingly materializing out of nowhere with her medical bag in hand. Her small stature was deceptive. She could carry a full-grown soldier to safety when necessary, fueled by adrenaline and determination that surprised even her. The morning of October 15th started like any other. Sarah was conducting medical checks on soldiers preparing for a routine patrol when urgent radio traffic filled the air. Alpha Company, a unit of 30 soldiers, had been conducting a village assessment mission when they walked into a carefully planned ambush. The Taliban had waited until the entire unit was inside the village before opening fire from multiple directions. Captain Williams, the base commander, called an emergency briefing. The situation was dire. Alpha Company was pinned down in a compound with limited ammunition and no way to evacuate their wounded. Helicopter support was unavailable due to heavy anti-aircraft fire, and ground reinforcements would take hours to fight their way through hostile territory. The radio operator's voice crackled with desperation as he reported multiple casualties and dwindling medical supplies. Sarah listened to the briefing with growing concern. She knew many of the soldiers in Alpha Company personally. Private Johnson, barely 19 years old, had shown her pictures of his newborn daughter just the week before. Sergeant Davis had been planning to propose to his girlfriend when he returned home. These weren't just casualty numbers, they were friends and colleagues whose lives hung in the balance. Dr. Peterson approached Sarah after the briefing. His face was grim as he explained the impossible decision facing them. Someone needed to reach Alpha Company with medical supplies and expertise, but the mission would be extremely dangerous. The route to the village was controlled by insurgents, and whoever went would likely face heavy resistance. Sarah didn't hesitate. She volunteered immediately. Captain Williams initially refused her request. Sending a medic into such a dangerous situation went against protocol, and Sarah was too valuable to risk. But as reports from Alpha Company grew more desperate, with soldiers bleeding out faster than their limited medical supplies could handle, The captain realized they had no choice. Sarah was the only medic small enough to move quickly through the terrain and experienced enough to handle mass casualties under fire. The mission plan was simple, but dangerous. Sarah would join a four-man team led by Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, a veteran special operations soldier. They would travel light and fast, using back roads and mountain paths to avoid the main Taliban positions. Once they reached the village, Sarah would stabilize the wounded while the team established a defensive perimeter for evacuation. Sarah packed her medical bag with everything she could carry: morphine for pain management, bandages for bleeding control, airway tubes for breathing assistance, and IV fluids for shock treatment. Every item was essential, but weight was a critical factor. She would be moving on foot for miles through mountainous terrain while carrying nearly 40 pounds of equipment. The team departed at sunset, using darkness as cover for their movement. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez led them through a series of dried creek beds and mountain passes that avoided known insurgent positions. Sarah struggled to keep up with the pace initially, but her months of deployment had improved her physical conditioning significantly. She focused on putting one foot in front of the other, knowing that lives depended on her reaching the village. 2 hours into the journey, they encountered their first obstacle. A Taliban checkpoint blocked the main path to the village, forcing them to take a longer route through more difficult terrain. The detour added miles to their journey and precious time that Alpha Company didn't have. Sarah could hear the distant sound of gunfire growing more intense as they climbed higher into the mountains. As they crested a ridge overlooking the village, Sarah could see the extent of the problem. Alpha Company was trapped in a small compound surrounded by insurgent positions. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness as both sides exchanged fire. The radio chatter from the compound was filled with urgent calls for medical assistance. Sarah counted at least 6 different voices calling for help with wounded soldiers. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez studied the situation through his night vision scope. The Taliban had established a complex ambush with fighters positioned in buildings surrounding the compound. Any attempt to reach Alpha Company would require fighting through multiple defensive positions. He turned to Sarah and asked if she was ready for what was about to happen. Her response was simple and direct. She was ready to do whatever was necessary to save her fellow soldiers. The assault began at midnight. Rodriguez's team moved systematically through the village, clearing insurgent positions one building at a time. Sarah stayed close behind, ready to treat any casualties from either side. The fighting was intense, with gunfire echoing off the stone walls and explosions lighting up the narrow streets. Sarah had never been in such close combat before, but her training kept her focused on her mission. When they finally breached the compound where Alpha Company was trapped, Sarah was horrified by what she found. 12 soldiers had been wounded, with injuries ranging from minor shrapnel wounds to life-threatening trauma. Several had been bleeding for hours, and their color was pale from blood loss. The company's medic, Specialist Thompson, had been treating casualties with supplies that had run out long ago. Sarah immediately took charge of the medical situation. She triaged the casualties, identifying those who needed immediate attention to survive. Private Martinez had taken a bullet to his abdomen and was showing signs of internal bleeding. Corporal Williams had shrapnel embedded in his chest that was making breathing difficult. Lieutenant Foster had been hit in the leg, and the bleeding hadn't been properly controlled due to lack of supplies. Working by flashlight while gunfire continued outside, Sarah began the most challenging medical work of her life. She started multiple IVs to combat shock, administered pain medication to conscious patients, and performed emergency procedures to stabilize the most critical cases. Specialist Thompson assisted her, amazed by her speed and competence under such extreme conditions. The most difficult case was Private Martinez. His internal bleeding was severe, and he needed surgery that Sarah couldn't perform in the field. She knew that his only chance of survival was immediate evacuation to the base hospital, but helicopter extraction remained impossible due to ongoing enemy fire. Sarah made a decision that would define her career. She would personally ensure that Martinez and the other critical patients reached advanced medical care, no matter what it took. As dawn approached, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez received word that a relief column was fighting its way toward the village. Armored vehicles and additional infantry were pushing through Taliban resistance, but they wouldn't arrive for at least 2 hours. Sarah looked at her patients and realized that Martinez didn't have 2 hours. She needed to find another solution. That's when she noticed Colonel Harrison lying unconscious in a corner of the compound. The battalion commander had been leading Alpha Company personally when the ambush occurred. He had taken a severe blow to his head and hadn't regained consciousness. Sarah realized that in all the chaos of treating wounded soldiers, she hadn't properly assessed the colonel's condition. When she examined him, she discovered that his injury was more serious than initially apparent, and he would need specialized medical care to survive. The longest walk. Sarah knelt beside Colonel Harrison as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the compound windows. His breathing was shallow and irregular, indicating serious brain trauma. Without immediate surgery, he would die within hours. Private Martinez was also deteriorating rapidly, his pulse growing weaker despite the IV fluids Sarah had administered. The relief column was still fighting its way through Taliban positions, and helicopter evacuation remained impossible. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez approached Sarah with grim news. The Taliban had reinforced their positions around the village during the night. The relief column was encountering much stronger resistance than expected and wouldn't reach them for at least 4 more hours. Radio intercepts suggested that insurgents were planning a final assault on the compound to eliminate the trapped Americans before help could arrive. Sarah made a decision that shocked everyone in the compound. She announced that she was going to carry Colonel Harrison and Private Martinez to the extraction point herself. The nearest suitable landing zone for helicopters was 2 miles away, across rough mountain terrain that was partially controlled by enemy forces. The other soldiers stared at her in disbelief. Sarah weighed barely 120 pounds, while Colonel Harrison alone weighed over 180 pounds. Specialist Thompson tried to talk her out of the plan. He pointed out that carrying 2 critically wounded men across such distance was physically impossible, especially while under potential enemy fire. Sarah listened to his concerns but remained determined. She had not come this far to watch soldiers die while waiting for rescue that might never come. She would find a way to save them, even if it killed her in the process. Sarah began preparing for the evacuation by creating improvised stretchers from materials found in the compound. She used wooden boards from damaged furniture, torn clothing for straps, and padding from military equipment. The stretchers needed to be light enough for her to pull across rough terrain while providing adequate support for injured spines. She worked quickly but carefully, knowing that poor construction could cause additional injuries. While Sarah prepared the stretchers, Rodriguez organized security for her journey. He would send 2 soldiers with her as escorts, keeping the rest to defend the compound. Sergeant Davis volunteered immediately, followed by Corporal Wilson. Both men had been impressed by Sarah's medical skills and were determined to help her succeed. Rodriguez gave them specific instructions to protect Sarah at all costs, even if it meant abandoning the patients. Private Martinez regained consciousness briefly as Sarah secured him to the first stretcher. He grabbed her hand weakly and asked if he was going to die. Sarah looked into his frightened eyes and made a promise that she intended to keep no matter what happened. She told him that she was taking him home to meet his newborn daughter, and that nothing would stop her from keeping that promise. Martinez squeezed her hand and lost consciousness again. Colonel Harrison remained unconscious as Sarah secured him to the second stretcher. She had improvised a harness system that would allow her to pull both stretchers simultaneously, distributing the weight across her shoulders and back. The design was crude but functional. Sarah tested the system by dragging both patients around the compound, making adjustments to reduce friction and improve balance. The journey began at dawn, with Sarah pulling both stretchers, while Sergeant Davis and Corporal Wilson provided security. The first mile took them through the village streets, where they had to move carefully to avoid alerting Taliban fighters who were still positioned in surrounding buildings. Sarah pulled the stretchers over broken concrete and around abandoned vehicles, constantly adjusting her route to find the smoothest path possible. Leaving the village meant climbing into the mountains along a barely visible goat trail. Sarah's shoulders ached from the constant strain of pulling nearly 400 pounds of patients and equipment, but she refused offers from her escorts to help. Davis and Wilson needed to keep their weapons ready for potential enemy contact. Sarah was the only one who could safely handle the medical aspects of patient transport. 1 hour into the journey, they encountered their first crisis. Private Martinez began showing signs of shock as his blood pressure dropped dangerously low. Sarah had to stop the convoy and establish another IV line while balancing on the narrow mountain path. She worked quickly, knowing that every minute they remained stationary increased the risk of enemy detection. Martinez's vital signs stabilized temporarily, but Sarah knew he was running out of time. The mountain terrain became increasingly difficult as they climbed higher. Sarah's boots struggled for traction on loose rocks and steep grades. Several times she lost her footing and nearly pulled both patients over dangerous cliff edges. Her escorts helped steady the stretchers during these moments, but the physical strain of maintaining progress was enormous. Sarah's legs trembled with exhaustion, and her breathing became labored in the thin mountain air. Halfway through the journey, they spotted Taliban fighters moving along a parallel ridge. Sergeant Davis counted at least 6 insurgents who appeared to be tracking their movement. Wilson radioed their position back to the base, requesting immediate helicopter support for extraction. The response was discouraging. Aircraft were still encountering heavy ground fire and couldn't risk landing until the area was secured. Sarah made another desperate decision. Instead of waiting for optimal conditions, she would continue toward the landing zone and trust that helicopters would be available when she arrived. The alternative was watching her patients die slowly on a mountainside while enemy forces closed in around them. She adjusted her harness straps and resumed pulling the stretchers up the increasingly steep trail. The Taliban fighters began closing the distance as Sarah's group reached the final approach to the landing zone. Davis and Wilson took defensive positions behind large rocks while Sarah continued dragging the patients forward. Gunfire erupted as insurgents opened fire from elevated positions. Bullets struck the ground around Sarah's feet, but she kept moving forward, protecting her patients with her own body. Colonel Harrison regained consciousness during the firefight. Despite his head injury, he immediately understood the situation and tried to remove himself from the stretcher to reduce Sarah's burden. Sarah shouted over the gunfire that he needed to remain still or risk permanent brain damage. The colonel protested that she was risking her life for his, but Sarah's response was immediate and firm. She hadn't carried him this far to let him die within sight of rescue. As they crested the final ridge, Sarah could see the designated landing zone spread out below them. It was a flat area barely large enough for a single helicopter, surrounded by steep terrain on all sides. More importantly, she could hear the distinctive sound of approaching aircraft. 2 Apache attack helicopters were inbound to suppress enemy fire, while a medical evacuation helicopter attempted to land. The final descent to the landing zone was the most dangerous part of the entire journey. Sarah had to lower the stretchers down a steep slope using ropes, while Taliban fighters continued shooting at them from above. Davis and Wilson provided covering fire, but ammunition was running low. Sarah's hands were cut and bleeding from handling rough rope, but she maintained careful control to prevent her patients from being injured during the descent. The medical helicopter appeared over the ridge just as Sarah reached the landing zone. Apache helicopters circled overhead, firing rockets at Taliban positions to keep insurgents away from the extraction point. The medical crew jumped out before their aircraft had fully landed, rushing to help Sarah load her patients. They were amazed to find both men still alive after such an ordeal. As the helicopter lifted off with Colonel Harrison and Private Martinez aboard, Sarah collapsed from exhaustion for the first time since beginning the rescue. Sergeant Davis and Corporal Wilson helped her board the second evacuation flight, which had landed to extract the remaining personnel. Sarah watched the landscape fall away below them and realized that she had somehow accomplished the impossible. Later investigation would reveal that Sarah had carried 2 critically wounded soldiers across 2.1 miles of hostile mountain terrain while under enemy fire. During her 7-month deployment, she would personally treat and save 200 soldiers, earning numerous commendations for valor and medical excellence. But for Sarah, the greatest reward was receiving a letter from Private Martinez 6 months later, along with a photograph of him holding his baby daughter. Colonel Harrison made a full recovery and personally recommended Sarah for promotion and advanced medical training. Sarah Martinez returned home to Texas as one of the most decorated combat medics in Army history. Her actions that day in Afghanistan became legendary within military medical circles, inspiring a new generation of medics who learned that courage and determination could overcome seemingly impossible odds. She had proven that being just a field medic meant being capable of extraordinary heroism when lives hung in the balance.